Hey guys, this is Joe with Unity Code Tutorials. Welcome to the 8th video. In this video, I'm going to show you how to create a method, which is something we've touched on, but we're going to learn to create our own. And also, we're going to do the shrapnel that I keep talking about. If you watched the recent video, the last video, the way the shrapnel is going to work is it's going to be some cubes that are going to pop out, and then you'll be able to shoot those cubes or collect them in some other way that maybe I haven't decided yet, and that will give you, either something good or bad will happen. We can always add to and take away from that later, but okay. First of all, I think it's important to learn about the method creation. So if we go into our vehicle script here, now this is going to become important down the road, no matter what you're trying to do. Okay, so if you look at this method, this is going to make more sense, right? So this onCollision enter method, this is a method that's predefined, and we're making use of it. But you can actually create your own methods. Not only can you do it, but you will want to, and it's a very productive thing to do. And it's very good for taking a certain thought and condensing it into a certain area. A method, it's called a method. And then that way you don't have to repeat code. If you want to make something happen, you can call that method instead of repeating the code. Now what I mean by that is, in this case, when the hit points is less than or equal to 0, what happens? We want to destroy the tank, right? So a few things happen when you destroy the tank. You increase the score, you create the explosion object, and then you actually destroy this game object, the tank, because it's destroyed, so you make it disappear. So what if there was something else that can happen later down the road that could destroy the tank? At this point there's not, but in the future maybe there will be. So if that were to happen right now, we'd have to rewrite these 3 lines of code. Or we could create a method for it, which means 1 line of code instead of 3. 1 line of code that will say, okay, do all this. So here's what we can do. We can create a method. So this is how you create a method. You start with the access modifier. For right now, the only place it's being accessed from is this script, so I'm going to say private, which means it can only be accessed from in here. If you say public, then it can be accessed from in here, anywhere. So we're going to say private. The next thing is the return type. It's going to be void. Now return type has to do with if we wanted to calculate something and then send a value back, that would be a return type. If we wanted to pass in a string or something, we'll get to that when we get to that. For let's say, for an example, being that I brought it up, let's say you have a bunch of different strings and you want to pass them into a method, and then you want the method to take those strings and tell you which one is the most common out of what you give it, and then return a certain one. Then here you would put the type. You would say private string, and then in here you would take all the things that are passed in and you would figure out which one is the most common, and then you would send it back, which means then we'll get to that when we get to that. Anyways, for this there's nothing being returned. Does that make sense? I'm trying to think of an example of something where a method that you can call where you actually return something. But off the top of my head, I can't think of any. But it's something that you will want to know about when the time comes. So the reason I'm talking about this slowly is because just kind of chew on that. Think about what you might use that for. Basically, well, okay. First, let's make this method, and then we can talk about that more. Okay, so we have this private void. It's not going to return a value, right? Now we have to give it a name. So what is happening in this case? What we're doing is we're destroying the vehicle. And this script is attached to a tank. But we want to keep it kind of generic because we might want to use this for a different vehicle later on. So let's just call it destroy vehicle. Now what you do is you do open and closing parentheses. Now if we wanted to pass in a parameter, we could do that. And in this case, a parameter is being passed in because we want to take certain information and use that inside the method. In this case, we don't need to do that because the script is already attached to the tank, and all we need to do is tell it what to do based on these three instructions here. That's what we're going to put in here. Now, of course, you want to have your open and closing braces. It's the same as one of these. So we're going to take this, I'm going to do Control C, copy that, put it in here. Now I'm going to take this, comment it out, Control Alt C, because we're using Maro Develop. Now here's what we can do. Instead of using those, all we have to do now is say destroy vehicle, open and closing parentheses. That's how you actually call the method. You have to use the open and closing parentheses. Even though there's no parameters to pass in, you have to do that because that tells it that you're calling the method. If you don't do that, you're naming the method, but you're not actually calling it. There's instances when you need to do that. That's more advanced. We'll get into that when we get into that. So, now the reason I comment these out and don't delete them is because if for some reason it doesn't work, I'm sure in this case it will, but more complicated situations, if for some reason it doesn't work, you still have it right here, and you can always revert back easier and figure out what the problem is. So now we want to shoot down our tank, right? And we want to make sure this is working properly. Let's go ahead and play our game. Shoot it down. Okay, explodes, it does what it's supposed to do. Awesome. Awesome. Now that I know that, I can go ahead and delete this. I don't need those comments. It works. Now, I do want to tell you what happens if you have a return type, because now that I open this can of worms, I want to finish it. So we're going to make another method here. Private, because we're going to call it from this script. String. Test method. This is the name. I'm naming it test method because that's what I'm going to name it. And then here's what we're going to do. We'll also get into parameters, but we're going to do one thing at a time. So if you have it return a string, we have to actually call this from somewhere, right? So let's call it from start. That means every time a tank is created, its start method will be called, right? And we'll call test method. So here's what we'll do. It returns a string, so we can make a string variable. We'll say string test string equals test method, and we have to call it with the open and closing parentheses. Okay, and then here's what we'll do. We'll debug.log the test string that is returned from that. So now we can do anything we want in this method, but we have to do what's called a return, because we say that it returns a value, so it has to return something. So what we can do here is we can say string A equals A, string B equals B. This will be a good review of randoms and if statements too. So then we can say if Random.Range minimum 1. Now notice there's two options. You can also use integers, so it's okay. So 1, and then let's say 2 is the maximum. Now notice, okay, the max is actually exclusive, so I have to do 3. That means the highest it can really be is 2, because the max is exclusive, which means one below it. In this case, we're using integers. is the highest that could be, right? So random.range 1, 2, 3. Now notice what I'm doing here. The last time I did this and I assigned it to a variable, which you could do, but you can also just put it right in the if statement, because it's going to return a value. This is an example. This is that example I was trying to think of earlier. This is going to return a value. So, think about that. So a lot of things you can do. You can take these pieces, you can put them together in a lot of different ways. So what this is going to do is it's either going to create a 1 or a 2. It's random. Pseudo-random. It's not true random. It's pseudo-random. It takes the time in milliseconds and does some complicated functions. You know, nothing's truly random. But it's random enough for our purposes. So if random, now I didn't actually make the comparison. So if that, it's either going to be 1 or 2, right? So we can say if it's equal to 1, I use 2 equal signs because we're doing comparison, we're not setting a value. We're like right here, we're setting a variable equal to something, and here we're doing a comparison. We're saying if it's equal to 1, then we want to return. Now we have to return a string. This method returns a string. That's why it says string right there. So we have to return something. So we'll say string A. Okay. And then we'll do an else. And we'll say return string B. Now you might be wondering why I even created these. The reason I did is because I decided afterwards that I was going to do this. At first I was going to do something different with these strings and say, well, I mean, I guess we could just return A. I mean, you could do that. Why don't we do that? And then I went to the trouble of creating those variables. I had a different idea, but this is better. So if I could get this right. If these are more complex strings, that would make more sense to have them in variables, you know, so we'll return them. Now, if we compile this, every time we make a tank, it's going to spit those out. So I'm going to start the game and go here. Okay, so we've got a B. We've got an A. See, as tanks are starting to be created in the background. A seems to be more popular. Not sure why. It should be 50%. You get the idea. Now, here's the thing. If you don't return anything, let's say we made this method, we say it's supposed to return a string, but there's no returns, right? Control S, save that, whatever, hit OK. Let's go back. We're going to get an error. It's going to say, not all code paths return a value. Now, the reason it's saying that is because the way we named this, it's supposed to return a string, but there's no paths that actually return something. So keep that in mind. Okay, that's methods. They can return stuff or they cannot. You can also pass in parameters. We'll get into that later on. I want to get to the shrapnel. How are we going to make the shrapnel? We need to make our actual shrapnel cube, right? So let's create a 3D object, cube. Focus on it. It's just a cube. Just a cube. Let's actually shrink it down. .5, and we'll say shrapnel. I think that's how you spell it. Cube. Throw it into prefabs. Now we're not going to add a script to the cube right now. We might later to make it do something, but right now we just want the shrapnel to pop out. So we've got our shrapnel cube. That's all it is. Now we do need to keep in mind, if we want it to pop out and act with physics, we need to have a rigid body on it. So we'll throw a rigid body on there. Now here's what's going to happen. When this tank explodes, we want it to spawn these shrapnel cubes. They could either come out of the explosion or they could come out of the vehicle. Right? Because we have our explosion. I think the vehicle should create it. So, first we need our variable up here, public game object, so we can assign it from the inspector. Let's call it shrapnel cube. So, we're going to go ahead and we're going to just comment this out for now. We're not using it. We're not going to actually call this anymore. I don't need to. So here's what's going on. When the vehicle gets destroyed, we want this to happen before it destroys it, right? So instantiate, now we want to spawn a cube. Okay, so here's the thing. We can do instantiate shrapnel cube, right? Transform.position, which refers to the position of the vehicle. Quaternion.identity, 000 rotation. Okay, so that'll spawn this cube. So we can decide, is this what we want? Now keep in mind, the tank has to have that assigned. It doesn't know what the shrapnel cube is yet. We're going to put it in here. Shrapnel cube. Now this tank, we have to also put it in. Oh, okay. It's already in there. I wasn't sure, being that it was in the scene already, if it was going to work like that. Where's our shrapnel cube? Okay, so it's way off somewhere in the great beyond. So what happened? I think what happened is it spawned inside of the tank, physics reacted with the tank, and it caused it to spew off. That's not what we want. It's not what we want at all. So you know what we could do? And this might not be a bad idea. What we could do here is we want the cube to not be able to collide with the tanks. So what we could do is, if we look at the tank, it's on default layer, right? What other layers do we have? We can always make one. Okay, so we have is no collision. I think I actually made that off camera. There's a way you can go to add layer. You can create however many layers. I don't know about that, but you can create a lot of layers, right? So no collision. So what you do is you create a layer. So what we can do is the shrapnel cube. We go here. Now you may not have seen how I did this. All you do is go here and you type one of these in. So no collision is the one that we want. So if we go to shrapnel cube then and set it to, actually I'm not going to use no collision. I'm going to just say shrapnel cube, make its own layer, right? And then after you type it in, you have to go back here and you have to actually assign it, and then we have to save the game. So it saves the prefab that we just created, the settings for it. Now here's the thing, if you go to edit, project settings, physics, this has to do with what can collide with what. So a shrapnel cube, right? What can it collide with? Okay, so you see shrapnel cube up here. Now what's a tank? Tank also needs its own layer. Okay, so put that there. Come here. Tank, yes, children too. Every part of the tank should be part of that same layer. Save the project. You know, I've been burned in the past, so I like to save the project very often. I think that's a good thing. Let's go back to our settings. What do? We go to edit, we go to project settings, physics. So look at this, here's a tank. If we go down the line, we don't want it to be able to conflict with the shrapnel cube. And then here's the shrapnel cube. It can collide with itself. We might not want to do that, but for now it can. For now we're just going to spawn one cube. Okay. So we have that. Also, when you change project settings, you want to save the project, because if something goes wrong, the game explodes, it'll be okay. Now it's still, something's not right. Why is that? Is this tank, is this part of the layer? It is part of the layer. And if we go here, if we go to the physics settings, the tank and the shrapnel cube are not supposed to be able to collide. So what I'm wondering is, where is the cube actually spawning? Here's what we could try. We could try transform.position, and then we can add vector 3, which is cool. We can add vector 3.up times 5. Now we have to use the float to multiply by this. Order of operations, remember math in school? Multiplication happens first and then addition. So it's going to multiply this by 5 and then it's going to add this. Now what I'm wondering is everything... Oh, here. Okay. Change the children. I don't know if that's part of it or not, but it could be. Now where's the cube? Where's the cube? It's not moving around ridiculously. It is. It's right here. See? Oh, it's right there. It's that little tiny cube. Little tiny cube. Okay. It's too small. Let's try to make it bigger. It's okay that it spawns above the tank, because I multiplied it by 5 and added it above the tank, because I thought maybe it was colliding with the tank, or the ground actually is also a possibility, but it works. So we create the cube. Now I want it to kind of spin around and do something funky. So here's what we can do too. We take the cube, so we need to create a variable, because then we want to actually manipulate it. Right? So here's what we'll do. We're going to make a game object variable. Capital G game object. So game object shrapnel cube equals. We can do this. I'm going to walk through this step by step so you see what happens here. If we assign that, go here, clear everything, it should be working, right? So we have that as a game object. Okay, so now here's what we do. This variable is going to be assigned to the shrapnel cube that's created. So now, shrapnel cube, lowercase, because lowercase is the variable name here, uppercase is the actual object that we had assigned from the inspector. So we do this dot get component less than sign. What component do we want to get? Rigid body. Capital R rigid body. Open and closing parentheses. It's just the way it is. Now what do we want to do with the rigid body? We want to add force, right? What kind of force do we want to add? It takes a vector 3. We don't have a vector 3 variable set up for this. So here's what we can do. Before this, the line before. Well, actually, we'll get into this. We'll get into that later on. For right now, let's just say vector 3 dot up times. Notice I use an asterisk. I don't know if I explained that. An asterisk is the multiplication. Let's just say times 15f, because it has to be a float, right? So what should happen if we do that? It should spawn the thing and then it should shoot it up in the air. Doesn't appear like it shot it up in the air. Could it be that we didn't? Do we need to shoot it up harder? I mean, so let's go extreme. This is what I usually do. Go extreme, because if you go extreme and it still doesn't work, something's terribly wrong. Okay, so looks like it shot it up in the air. Still not the extreme I'm looking for, though. 5,000 doesn't do it. There's a serious problem. Okay, 5,000 does it. So we can experiment with that later, right? Let's just do 750. Okay, now we want to spin it. So let's do this. Shrapnel cube dot what? Get component. Rigid body. Add torque. Now here's what we can do. I'm just going to do this. We've done this before. You can create a new one. We can create a new vector 3 and then assign whatever values we want. So for the x, let's do Random.Range 0f all the way to 255f. Now y component, let's take this. I was going to do it in the next video, but you guys can handle this. We're creating a new vector 3. We're assigning it to these values. You see what I mean about putting the pieces of the puzzle wherever you want, within reason, of course, depending on what's going on. So that should randomize the torque. Torque, remember from physics class in high school, torque has to do with rotation. It's a force of rotation. So, I know this video is getting long. There we go, we've got torque, and every tank will be different. Now I feel like it shouldn't just shoot it up, it should also shoot it to the side. But if I play it again, watch the torque, it's going to be different, right? So try to remember how that one was spinning. That one's going to spin a little different. Now it is always spinning to the left, so what we want to do is we want to make the negatives, we want to make the minimum negative 255. Right? Control C, copy that. Compile. See, now there's more variation. If we wanted even more, we could just change the random range. See, there we go. Now we can apply that same principle to make it not just go up, but make it also go side to side. Then we'll see as we get to that video where we're going to change what kind of bullet. We'll be able to shoot a certain bullet at it or something to collect it and see what it does. See what kind of power up it gives us. Okay, well, in the next video, I think we're going to get to actually having the tanks shoot at us. We're going to have a base that we're protecting, something like that, unless I change my mind between now and then. But this video is too long, it's 30 minutes already, so I'm going to let you guys go. Have a good night, and thank you for watching. I look forward to seeing you in the next video.